I became a widow on a quiet Tuesday morning, and 14 days later my own daughter looked me in the eye and said something I will never forget. Either you get a job or you're out on the street. For a moment I thought I had misheard her. The kitchen clock ticked above the refrigerator, steady and loud, the same clock my husband Robert hung there 20 years ago after we remodeled the house. I was still holding a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. The words sat in the room like heavy furniture that no one could move. Jessica didn't raise her voice. She didn't look angry. That was the part that unsettled me the most. She sounded practical, almost polite, the way someone might discuss the weather or the price of gas. I glanced around the kitchen, the one Robert and I had paid off after 42 years of work, the oak cabinets we installed ourselves one summer when it was 90 degrees outside and the air conditioner barely worked. Every corner of that room carried a memory. Birthday cakes cooling on the counter. Thanksgiving mornings that started before sunrise. Jessica sitting at that very table doing her homework while Robert pretended to be a strict math teacher. And now she was sitting there again. Only this time she looked at me like I was a guest who had overstayed her welcome. "Mom," she said again, softer this time. "You can't just live here without contributing." I didn't answer right away. I set the mug down carefully on the counter, the way Robert used to do when he was thinking through something difficult. 2 weeks earlier I had been standing beside his hospital bed holding his hand while the monitors beeped quietly in the background. 2 weeks earlier my biggest fear was learning how to sleep in a bed that suddenly felt too large. I had not expected to lose my place in my own home. Jessica tapped her phone against the table, impatient but controlled. Her husband Daniel leaned against the doorway behind her, arms folded, silent. The house felt different with them standing there. Smaller. Colder. I noticed little details that hadn't seemed important before. The new lock on the back door. The stack of unopened mail that used to be Robert's responsibility. The way Jessica kept glancing at her phone as if there were somewhere more important to be. "You're only 67, she said finally. "People work at that age all the time." 67. The number sounded strange when she said it, like she was reading from a document instead of talking to her mother. I nodded slowly, as if I were considering her suggestion. But something inside me had already begun to shift, quiet and steady. Robert used to say that the truth had a way of revealing itself when people thought they had everything under control. I didn't argue with Jessica that morning. I didn't remind her whose name had been on every mortgage payment for the last 4 decades. Instead I walked past her toward the hallway, pretending to be tired, pretending the conversation was over. But later that afternoon while the house was quiet again, I opened my laptop at the kitchen table and saw something that made my hands go completely still. My home, our home, was listed for sale online. And the seller's name wasn't mine. I stared at the screen for a long time before I even scrolled down. The listing looked professional, polished, the kind of real estate page you see when a family decides it is time to move somewhere bigger. Bright photos of the living room. The front porch with the white railing Robert painted himself every spring. Even the maple tree in the yard was there. The one we planted when Jessica turned 8 years old. Under the photos was a line that made my chest tighten. Listed by Jessica Brooks. I did not move for a few seconds. The quiet in the house felt heavier than it had that morning. I clicked through the photos slowly, recognizing every corner like pages from an old family album. There was the kitchen table where Jessica had just told me I needed to find a job. There was the hallway where Robert used to mark her height with a pencil every birthday. Someone had even opened the curtains in the guest bedroom to let the afternoon light pour in. It looked warm and inviting, like a house waiting for strangers. I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands together, the way Robert used to when he was thinking through a problem at work. Something about the listing felt rushed. The price was slightly lower than the homes around us. The description said the property would be available soon, ready for immediate closing. Immediate. That word stayed with me. Robert and I did not rush things. When we bought this house 42 years ago, we spent weeks walking through the rooms, measuring walls, planning where the furniture would go. We talked about the future in that empty living room. We talked about children, holidays, quiet Sunday mornings. Robert used to say a home should never feel temporary. A home should feel rooted. I closed the laptop slowly and looked around the kitchen again. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the floor. For the first time since Robert passed away, The house did not feel like a place of comfort. It felt like a place someone was quietly preparing to take away from me. I remembered the way Jessica had tapped her phone against the table earlier that morning. The quick glances toward Daniel standing in the doorway. The calm tone in her voice when she told me I needed to work if I wanted to stay. It had not sounded like anger. It had sounded like a decision already made. I stood up and walked through the house slowly room by room. The living room still smelled faintly like the lemon polish Robert liked to use on the wood shelves. The hallway was lined with framed photographs from decades of family dinners and school graduations. In the master bedroom, Robert's old reading chair sat by the window exactly where he left it. I placed my hand on the back of that chair and felt the steady calm he used to carry into every problem we faced together. Robert was careful, thoughtful, the kind of man who planned 3 steps ahead even when things seemed perfectly fine. That thought settled quietly in my mind as I walked back toward the kitchen. Because if someone as careful as Robert had spent 42 years building this life, there was one question I could not ignore. Would he really have left everything so easy for someone else to take? I sat at the kitchen table long after the sun had disappeared behind the maple tree in the yard. The house felt unusually still. The kind of silence that settles in when everyone else has left, and the walls begin to remember old conversations. I opened the laptop again and looked at the listing one more time, studying every line carefully. The description talked about a charming family home, quiet neighborhood, spacious backyard, perfect for new beginnings. New beginnings. That phrase almost made me smile. Robert used to laugh at real estate descriptions like that. He would say people always write about new beginnings because they forget that every house carries the weight of the past. I clicked through the listing again and noticed something I had missed earlier. The contact number on the page was not Jessica's personal number. It belonged to a real estate office downtown. That meant paperwork had already been signed. Meetings had already happened. Plans had already been made without a single word to me. I closed the laptop slowly and rested my hands on the table. For a moment I let the memories come back the way they often did late at night. Robert sitting across from me with a cup of coffee, reading the newspaper and occasionally pointing out something interesting. Jessica running down the hallway as a child, her backpack bouncing against the wall after school. Those memories were not dramatic. They were ordinary. But they were real, and they belonged to this house just as much as the walls and floors did. The thought that someone could quietly try to erase all of that felt strange, almost unreal. I stood up and walked toward the hallway closet where Robert kept most of our old documents. The door creaked slightly when I opened it. Inside were neat rows of labeled folders, each one marked in Robert's careful handwriting. Taxes, insurance, property records. Robert believed in keeping things organized. He used to say that confusion was where mistakes were born. I ran my fingers along the folders slowly until I reached the one labeled house documents. The paper inside was thick and slightly yellowed at the edges. Mortgage statements from years ago. Property tax receipts. The official deed with both of our names printed clearly across the top. Margaret Whitmore and Robert Whitmore. I looked at that line for a long time. Our names had always stood side by side on every important document in our lives. That was the promise we made when we built this home together. A quiet promise that neither of us would stand alone when decisions were made. I returned to the kitchen with the folder and placed it next to the laptop. Outside, the porch light had turned on automatically, casting a soft glow through the window above the sink. The listing for the house was still open on the screen. The photos looked peaceful, almost staged, like a story someone else was trying to tell about a place they did not truly understand. I noticed another detail then. At the bottom of the listing page there was a small note about upcoming private showings scheduled for later that week. People were already preparing to walk through the front door. Strangers would stand in the living room where Robert and I had spent 42 years building a life together. I leaned back in the chair and folded my hands again. If Jessica believed this plan would move forward quietly, then she had underestimated something important. Robert Whitmore did not spend his life building a home only to leave it unprotected. And if there was one thing I knew about my husband, it was that he always prepared for the moment when someone might try to take what belonged to his family. I did not sleep much that night. The house creaked the way old houses sometimes do when the temperature drops after sunset, and every sound seemed louder than usual. Around 2 in the morning I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, The same slow routine I had followed for years when something was on my mind. The porch light was still glowing outside, and the maple tree cast long shadows across the yard. Robert used to say that problems often look bigger in the middle of the night. He believed morning had a way of clarifying things. By the time the first light touched the windows, I already knew what I needed to do. I made coffee and sat down at the kitchen table again, the folder of house documents resting beside the laptop. The listing for the house was still active online. Several new viewing times had appeared overnight. Someone was clearly moving quickly. I opened the folder and began reading through each document slowly, page by page. Robert had always been careful with paperwork. Every receipt was dated. Every contract had notes written neatly in the margins. It felt almost like he was still guiding my hands through the pages. About halfway through the folder, I noticed something unusual. Behind the property deed was another sealed envelope, slightly thicker than the other papers and addressed in Robert's familiar handwriting. Margaret. The sight of my name written there made my chest tighten. Robert had placed it carefully between the documents, as if he expected me to find it only when I truly needed it. I turned the envelope over slowly in my hands. The paper felt firm, untouched. For a moment I simply stared at it, remembering the quiet evenings when Robert would sit at this same table reviewing bills or planning our finances. He was not the type of man who left things unfinished. If he prepared something like this, there was a reason. I opened the envelope carefully and slid the papers inside onto the table. The first page was a letter written in Robert's steady handwriting. I read the first line twice before the meaning settled in. If you are reading this, it means something is happening with the house that does not feel right. I leaned back in the chair, feeling that familiar calm presence Robert always carried when he was solving a problem. The letter continued with clear instructions. Robert explained that he had worked with our attorney several months before his illness became serious. There were additional protections placed on the property, documents that would only matter if someone tried to change ownership without my full consent. I looked again at the laptop screen where the house listing remained open. For the first time since I had seen it, the tight feeling in my chest eased slightly. Robert had anticipated more than I realized. He had prepared more than anyone else knew. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the table beside the folder. The quiet morning light filled the kitchen, touching the old cabinets and the worn edges of the table where our family had shared thousands of ordinary moments. Jessica believed this house was simply an asset waiting to be sold, but Robert had never treated it that way. To him, this place represented the work of a lifetime, something meant to protect the people he loved. And now, sitting there with his letter in my hands, I understood that whatever plan Jessica had already set into motion was about to face something she had not expected. I read Robert's letter 3 more times before the coffee beside me turned cold again. His handwriting had always been steady, even near the end of his illness, and every sentence in that letter felt deliberate. Robert never believed in dramatic gestures. He believed in preparation. The letter explained that months earlier he had met with our longtime attorney, Harold Bennett, the same man who helped us close on this house more than 4 decades ago. Robert wrote that if anything ever felt wrong about the ownership of the house, I should not argue with anyone. I should not panic. I should simply contact Harold and bring the documents Robert had prepared. The instructions were calm and practical, exactly the way Robert handled every problem during our marriage. I looked at the next page inside the envelope. It was a legal document printed on thick paper with Harold Bennett's office heading across the top. Several paragraphs of formal language explained that certain protections had been placed on the property. I did not fully understand every legal phrase, but one sentence stood out clearly enough to read without confusion. Any attempt to transfer or sell the property without my direct written approval would immediately trigger a legal review and freeze the transaction. I rested my hands on the table and let that sentence settle into the quiet room. Outside, the neighborhood had begun to wake up. A car passed slowly down the street. Somewhere a lawn sprinkler clicked on and off in steady rhythm. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary morning life. And yet everything felt different now. I turned my attention back to the laptop screen. The real estate listing still displayed the same inviting photos and cheerful language about a welcoming home ready for its next chapter. There was no mention of Robert. No mention of the decades we spent building the life inside those walls. To the outside world, it was simply a property waiting for a buyer. But Robert had known better than that. I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the legal document. Jessica must have believed that placing the house online would move things forward quickly, quietly, before I had time to react. Perhaps she assumed grief would leave me confused or passive. Perhaps she believed the paperwork had already been settled. But Robert had never underestimated how complicated people could become when money was involved. I stood and walked slowly through the living room again. Morning sunlight filled the space, touching the framed photographs on the shelves and the worn armchair Robert used every evening. Everything looked exactly the same as it had for years, and yet I understood something new about it now. This house had never simply belonged to the moment. Robert had built it with the future in mind. I returned to the kitchen and looked at the phone resting beside the laptop. Harold Bennett's number was still written inside an old address book Robert kept in the drawer. I opened the drawer and found it exactly where it had always been. The pages were slightly worn from years of use, but the number was still clear. I traced my finger across the line slowly. If the listing online meant that showings were already scheduled, then Jessica and Daniel believed everything was under control. They believed the next steps would happen smoothly. What they did not know was that Robert had left one final step of his own, and that step was about to begin. I sat at the kitchen table for a long moment with the address book open in front of me. Robert always kept things simple. Important numbers were written clearly in blue ink, never crossed out, never scribbled over. Harold Bennett's name sat quietly on the page between our insurance agent and the old family doctor we used to visit when Jessica was a child. I ran my finger over the number once before picking up the phone. The house was quiet again. Jessica and Daniel had left earlier that morning, saying they had errands to run. I suspected those errands had something to do with the house listing, but I did not ask. Robert's letter had been clear about one thing. Do not argue. Do not rush. Simply take the next step. I dialed the number slowly and listened to the steady ringing on the other end. After the third ring, a calm voice answered. Bennett and Cole Law Office. This is Patricia speaking. For a moment I hesitated. It had been years since I last spoke with anyone from that office. Robert usually handled the legal matters himself. My name is Margaret Whitmore, I said finally. I believe my husband Robert Whitmore worked with Mr. Harold Bennett. There was a brief pause on the line, the quiet sound of someone typing on a keyboard. Yes, Mrs. Whitmore, the voice replied gently. Mr. Bennett remembers your husband very well. Would you like me to connect you with him? A minute later another voice came onto the line, older and steady. The kind of voice that carries years of careful work behind it. Margaret, he said, and I could almost hear the recognition in his tone. I am very sorry about Robert. He was a remarkable man. Thank you, I replied softly. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Then I explained why I was calling. I told him about the house listing online. I told him about the letter Robert had left in the folder. On the other end of the line, Mr. Bennett remained quiet while I spoke. When I finished, he exhaled slowly as if he had expected this moment might arrive one day. Robert asked me to prepare something for you, he said. He was very clear that if you ever called about the house, we should meet immediately. I looked at the documents spread across the kitchen table. The morning light had shifted again, now reaching the edge of Robert's old coffee mug near the sink. There was a calm feeling settling into the room. The kind of calm that comes when a plan begins to unfold exactly as it was intended. Mr. Bennett suggested we meet that afternoon at his office downtown. He asked me to bring every document Robert had left behind, including the sealed letter. Before ending the call, he added one more thing in a careful tone. Margaret, if the property has already been listed publicly, then your daughter and her husband may believe the transaction is moving forward without any complications. I held the phone quietly as his words settled in. But the documents Robert prepared, he continued, changed that situation entirely. When I hung up, the house felt different again. Not threatened. Not uncertain. Just quiet and steady, the way it had always been when Robert was working through a problem no one else understood yet. I gathered the folder, the letter, and the additional documents and placed them neatly into my handbag. Outside, the maple tree moved gently in the breeze, scattering small shadows across the front yard. Somewhere in the distance a car door closed and a neighbor started their morning commute. Ordinary life was continuing exactly as it always had. But by the time the sun reached the middle of the afternoon, the quiet plan Robert Whitmore had prepared months ago was finally going to be set in motion. I left the house just after noon with Robert's folder resting carefully inside my handbag. The drive into town felt familiar. The same quiet streets and small intersections I had driven through for decades. Yet everything looked slightly different that afternoon. As if the world had shifted just enough to remind me that life rarely stays as steady as we expect. Harold Bennett's office sat on the second floor of a brick building near the courthouse square, a place Robert and I had visited many years ago when we first signed the final papers for the house. The waiting room looked almost unchanged. The same dark wood desk. The same framed photographs of old buildings from around the county. A young assistant greeted me kindly and asked me to take a seat. While I waited, I noticed how calm I felt. The tight knot of worry that had followed me since discovering the house listing had begun to loosen. Robert had always believed that preparation removes fear. For the first time since everything started, I understood exactly what he meant. A few minutes later, Harold Bennett stepped into the room. He was older now, his hair nearly white, but his posture was straight and his expression thoughtful in the same way I remembered. "Margaret," he said warmly as he shook my hand. "Robert spoke about you often during our last meeting." I followed him into his office where a large wooden desk sat beneath tall windows that overlooked the courthouse lawn. I placed the folder in front of him and carefully removed the documents Robert had left behind. Mr. Bennett read through the letter slowly, occasionally nodding as he turned each page. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of paper moving across the desk. After several minutes he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. "Your husband was a very careful man," he said. "He came to see me 6 months before his illness worsened. At the time he told me he wanted to make sure you would always be protected in this house no matter what happened after he was gone." I listened quietly while he opened another folder from his desk drawer. Inside were copies of the documents Robert had mentioned in the letter. Legal protections, property restrictions, clauses that prevented the house from being transferred or sold, unless certain conditions were fully met. Mr. Bennett explained that Robert had anticipated the possibility that someone might attempt to take control of the property quickly after his passing. For that reason he had created a safeguard that required direct verification from our office before any sale could proceed. I glanced out the window for a moment, watching a few people cross the courthouse lawn in the afternoon sunlight. The situation that had felt overwhelming just a day earlier now looked very different. Mr. Bennett continued reviewing the papers carefully before finally placing them back into the folder. "If your daughter has already listed the property publicly," he said calmly, "the real estate office will soon discover that the transaction cannot move forward. The legal hold Robert created will prevent any closing until this matter is reviewed in full." I felt a quiet sense of understanding settle over me. Jessica and Daniel believed they had already set everything in motion. They believed the house was simply waiting for new owners to arrive. But Robert had built something stronger than that. As I gathered the documents and placed them back into my handbag, Mr. Bennett looked at me thoughtfully and added one final sentence that carried more weight than the rest. "By the time the real estate office contacts your daughter about the legal hold on this property, Margaret, she is going to realize that your husband planned further ahead than she ever imagined." I drove home from Harold Bennett's office just as the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the neighborhood. The same streets looked calmer now, almost familiar again, like a place that had been waiting for things to settle back into their proper order. When I pulled into the driveway, Jessica's car was already parked near the garage. That told me she had returned earlier than I expected. For a moment I sat in the car with the engine off, watching the front porch and the maple tree that Robert and I planted so many years ago. The house stood quietly, exactly the same as it had that morning. Nothing about the outside suggested the quiet legal storm that had already begun moving behind the scenes. I stepped out of the car and walked up the porch steps slowly, the folder of documents resting safely in my handbag. Inside the house I could hear voices from the kitchen. Jessica and Daniel were talking in low tones, the way people do when they believe they are discussing something important. I set my keys down on the small table near the door and walked into the room. Both of them looked up at the same time. Jessica's expression shifted quickly, from surprise to something closer to impatience. "Mom," she said, "you have been gone most of the day. I had things I needed to take care of, I replied calmly. Daniel stood beside the counter with his phone in his hand, scrolling through something on the screen. For a moment no one spoke. Then Jessica reached for a glass of water and leaned against the counter. A couple from the real estate office might bring buyers to see the house this weekend, she said casually. It is better if everything moves quickly. I nodded slowly as if I were hearing the information for the first time. The kitchen window behind her reflected the fading sunlight, and for a brief second I noticed how much she looked like the little girl who used to sit at this table doing homework while Robert made jokes about math problems. But that memory passed as quickly as it came. Jessica continued speaking about paperwork and possible offers, explaining the situation as though the decision had already been finalized. I listened quietly, remembering Mr. Bennett's words earlier that afternoon. The transaction cannot move forward. A legal hold will stop everything. Daniel finally looked up from his phone. The real estate agent says there has already been interest, he added. People like houses in this neighborhood. I placed my handbag gently on the table and rested my hands on the back of a chair. The room felt calm, almost peaceful, which made the moment even clearer. Jessica believed she had already taken control of the situation. She believed the next step would simply be showing the house to strangers who might one day live there. But somewhere across town, the documents Robert prepared were already beginning to change that assumption. I looked at my daughter carefully before speaking. If the real estate office contacts you tomorrow, I said quietly, you may want to listen very closely to what they tell you. Jessica frowned slightly, confused by the calm tone in my voice. What do you mean by that? She asked. I did not answer right away. Instead, I picked up my keys and walked toward the hallway, leaving the question hanging in the quiet kitchen air. Because by the time the real estate office discovered the legal hold attached to this house, Jessica was going to realize that the story she thought she was writing had already been rewritten long before she placed that listing online. I woke early the next morning to the soft sound of rain tapping against the kitchen window. The house felt calm again, the way it used to feel when Robert woke before sunrise to make coffee while the rest of the world was still quiet. I sat at the same kitchen table where everything had started days earlier and wrapped my hands around a warm mug. Across the room, Jessica's car was still parked in the driveway, and I could hear faint movement upstairs where she and Daniel were getting ready for the day. The silence in the house did not last long. Around 9 o'clock, Jessica's phone rang sharply from the living room. I heard her footsteps hurry down the hallway, and then stop suddenly as she answered the call. At first her voice sounded confident, the same tone she had used when she spoke about showing the house to buyers. But after a few seconds that confidence began to fade. I could not hear the voice on the other end of the call, but Jessica's responses told me everything I needed to know. Wait, what do you mean there is a hold on the property? She said slowly. There must be some mistake. This house belongs to my family. I listened quietly from the kitchen as the conversation continued. The rain outside had grown heavier, tapping steadily against the roof like a quiet clock marking the moment. Jessica began pacing across the living room floor. Daniel soon joined her, asking questions in a low voice while she tried to understand what the real estate office was explaining. A legal restriction attached to the property. Documentation filed months earlier. Verification required before any sale could proceed. Finally, Jessica ended the call and stood silently in the middle of the living room. For the first time since Robert passed away, the certainty in her posture had completely disappeared. She walked into the kitchen slowly and stared at me across the table. Mom, she said carefully, the real estate office says there is some kind of legal protection attached to this house. I nodded once and set my coffee cup down. Yes, I said calmly. Your father arranged that before he passed away. Jessica's expression tightened with confusion. Why would he do that? She asked. I reached for the folder that rested beside me on the table, and opened it so she could see the documents inside. Because he wanted to make sure this home could never be taken away from me, I explained. The room grew very quiet after that. Daniel looked down at the papers while Jessica slowly pulled out a chair and sat across from me. Outside, the rain began to soften, and a thin beam of sunlight slipped through the clouds and touched the maple tree in the front yard. I watched the branches move gently in the breeze and felt a steady calm settle inside my chest. Robert had known that people sometimes change when money or property becomes involved. But he also knew something else. He knew that patience and preparation are stronger than anger. Jessica finally looked up from the documents with a long breath. realizing the truth that had been waiting there all along. This house was never leaving my name, and the future she had tried to force into motion was already over before it truly began.